Imagine the scene. It is August 14, 2005, at Larnaca International Airport in Cyprus. The morning sun blazes down on a Boeing 737-300, designated as Helios Airways Flight 522. Imagine the air conditioning humming inside the cabin as 115 passengers and 6 crew members buckle their seatbelts for a routine flight to Athens, Greece. The central figure of this technical unit is Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten, a 58-year-old seasoned contract pilot, alongside a young 21-year-old first officer. They are both highly trained professionals navigating a high-tech modern aircraft. At exactly 9:07 a.m., the twin engines roar to life, and the heavy metal bird ascends effortlessly into the cloudless blue sky. For the first few minutes, the mechanics of the climb are flawless. But as the plane crosses 12,000 feet, a silent, microscopic failure begins to sabotage the atmosphere inside the pressurized tube. An audible warning horn starts blaring in the cockpit. Captain Merten, misinterpreting the audio cue, believes it is a configuration warning about the takeoff settings, completely unaware that the cabin pressure is dropping rapidly. The archive is open. The timeline of the total biological exclusion of Flight 522 begins with a single knob left in the wrong position. Technical density expansion. The aircraft had undergone maintenance the previous night to repair a rear door seal. The ground engineer utilized a manual pressure test rig, shifting the pressurization mode switch from auto to manual. This critical configuration state was never reset to auto during the pilot's pre-flight checklist, creating a severe systemic error where the automated valves remained wide open, venting the vital oxygen into the upper atmosphere as the plane climbed. The aircraft continues its automated climb, passing through 18,000, then 24,000 feet. By 9:20 a.m., the lack of oxygen, hypoxia, reaches a lethal concentration in the bloodstreams of everyone on board. Inside the cabin, the yellow oxygen masks deploy from the ceiling automatically, a desperate mechanical defense mechanism. But these masks only provide 12 minutes of chemical oxygen flow. In the cockpit, the pilots are fighting an invisible, odorless enemy that directly sabotages the human brain. Hypoxia does not cause pain. It causes euphoria, confusion, and sudden cognitive failure. Imagine First Officer Pampos staring listlessly at his navigation screens, his hands falling limp from the controls as his nervous system quietly shuts down. Captain Merten struggles to communicate with the ground engineering team via radio, but his slurred words make no logical sense. By the time the aircraft levels off at its cruise altitude of 34,000 feet, the pilots have slipped into deep, irreversible comas. The power dynamic shifts entirely to the digital autopilot. The plane is now a flying tomb, guided by lines of pre-programmed code, carrying 121 unconscious or deceased human beings across the Mediterranean Sea at 500 miles per hour. Technical density expansion. At 34,000 feet, the partial pressure of oxygen is insufficient to support human life, giving individuals a time of useful consciousness (TUC) of less than 30 seconds without supplemental systems. The continuous oxygen starvation targeted the cerebral cortex first, inducing a state of deep anoxia that eliminated all voluntary motor functions while the CFM56 engines maintained their rigid, computer-controlled cruising speed. The automated Ghost flight enters Greek airspace on a strict preset vector, but it fails to respond to any air traffic control frequencies. Imagine the growing panic in the operations rooms on the ground in Athens. The silent aircraft is moving precisely along its flight plan, but it is a ghost on the radar. At 11:05 a.m., the Greek military decides to launch a tactical intervention, scrambling 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept the rogue airliner. Imagine the jet pilots zooming up to 34,000 feet, pulling alongside the massive Boeing. The military pilots look through the cabin windows of Flight 522, and what they see is a chilling scene of total biological deletion. The passengers are slumped over in their seats, motionless, their faces pale under the dangling yellow masks. In the cockpit, the F-16 pilots report that the first officer is slumped over the controls, unconscious, and the captain's seat is completely empty. The plane is flying itself over the ancient landscape of Greece, completely isolated from human touch. The forensic trace of this moment is captured on the tactical camera footage of the military jets, documenting a flying monument to a systemic checklist failure. Technical density expansion. The F-16 pilots performed close proximity observation maneuvers, matching the airliner's speed of 430 knots. They confirmed that the passenger cabin emergency oxygen generators had been exhausted hours prior, as evidenced by the lack of thermal activity in the chemical canisters, indicating that the occupants had been in a state of deep hypoxic coma for over 60 minutes before the fighter jets arrived. The clock moves toward 11:40 a.m. The ghost flight has reached the Athens area, entering a holding pattern programmed into the flight management computer. Suddenly, a movement is detected in the cockpit. A figure enters the empty captain's seat and grips the controls. This is Andreas Prodromou, a 25-year-old flight attendant and aspiring commercial pilot. Andreas had managed to survive the invisible trap by utilizing portable oxygen bottles scattered through the cabin, moving from one canister to the next like an underwater diver in a ruined city. Imagine the psychological weight on this young man. He's the only conscious human being alive on a plane filled with over 100 ghosts. He puts on a pilot's headset and attempts a desperate radio transmission, "Mayday, Mayday, Helios Airways Flight 522 Athens." But his voice is broadcast on the wrong frequency, a final, heartbreaking failure of communication. He can see the F-16 jets right outside his window, the military pilots making frantic hand signals to him. Andreas is a trained scuba diver with an advanced lung capacity, but his portable oxygen supply is down to the final cubic centimeters. The power dynamic shifts to a mechanical race against a shrinking fuel tank. Technical density expansion. Prodromou held a UK private pilot license and had logged several hours on light aircraft, but he lacked the multi-engine type rating required to manage the complex hydraulic and autopilot overrides of a Boeing 737. The structural architecture of the cockpit door, reinforced post-2001, many had spent over an hour attempting to bypass the security lock code before finally gaining access to the control deck. At exactly 11:49 a.m., the mechanics of the aircraft take over the timeline of destruction. The left engine, starved of fuel after hours of holding patterns, coughs, sputters, and dies. The sudden loss of thrust causes the autopilot to disconnect with a sharp audio chime. Andreas Prodromou grips the control yoke, trying manually to keep the nose of the massive steel machine level. 10 minutes later, at 12:03 p.m., the right engine suffers its own definitive fuel starvation, flaming out over the hills of Gromatico. The roaring sound of the engines is replaced by the eerie, rushing whistle of the wind against the dead airframe. The plane becomes a 140,000-pound glider, slipping rapidly out of the sky. Imagine the military pilots watching through their visors as the giant Boeing curves downward toward the mountainous terrain. Andreas fights the heavy, unassisted controls until the last millisecond, steering the plane away from a nearby village. The impact is a catastrophic mechanical collision at 300 knots, a wave of kinetic energy that completely pulverizes the fuselage against the rocky hillside. In an instant, the timeline of Flight 522 ends in a massive plume of fire and a rain of silver debris. Technical density expansion. The impact occurred at an elevation of 1,200 feet above sea level. The initial point of contact was the right wing tip, which initiated a high-velocity cartwheel maneuver, subjecting the internal structure to forces exceeding 50 G. Forensic recovery teams confirmed that death for all remaining occupants was instantaneous, occurring due to severe deceleration trauma before the ensuing post-crash fuel fire. The investigation by the Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board is a meticulous search through a blackened field of ash and twisted aluminum. The primary technical artifact is the overhead panel of the cockpit wreckage. Parents dig through the char debris until they find the cabin pressure selector switch. This is the smoking gun of the dossier. The selector dial is pointing directly to manual. The forensic audit confirms that there was no mechanical failure of the outflow valves or the fuselage skin. The plane vanished from the living world because a 3-centimeter plastic knob was left turned 90 degrees to the left. We analyze this as an absolute systemic failure of human-machine interface. The ground engineer who signed off on the maintenance log admitted he did not return the switch to auto. The pilots, rushing through a dense pre-flight checklist with over 80 separate checkpoints, simply glanced over the selector, their brains failing to see the anomaly. Every aviation disaster leaves a paper trail, and here the trail is an unchecked setting that acted as an invisible executor. Technical density expansion. The Boeing 737-300 Digital Flight Data Recorder, DFDR, captured the exact microsecond the cabin altitude exceeded 10,000 feet, triggering the master caution warning. The warning horn used the exact same sonic frequency as the takeoff configuration horn, a fatal design flaw that directly induced the captain's cognitive bias, leading him to troubleshoot the wrong system until his brain function was deleted by hypoxia. The legal trial that followed the tragedy of the Helios flight was a battleground of institutional blame. The airline attempted to pass the responsibility to Boeing, claiming the warning systems were poorly designed and intentionally confusing for international flight crews. Boeing countered with the technical logs, proving that the aircraft operated exactly as it was engineered to do. Imagine the intense expressions of the families in the courtroom as executives traded technical jargon to avoid a criminal conviction. 5 officials from Helios Airways were eventually charged with manslaughter, the negligence documented in an official report that reshaped European aviation safety laws forever. The airline went bankrupt within months, a corporate deletion that matched the physical erasure of its fleet. We analyze this case as a warning about the fragility of modern automated safety networks. When a human pilot becomes too reliant on the computer to maintain the atmosphere, a minor human oversight can transform a state-of-the-art aircraft into a runaway ghost ship. Technical density expansion. The European Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, issued emergency airworthiness directives following the trial, mandating a complete audit of all 737 warning horn systems. The new protocols required an independent digital light indicator on the instrument panel specifically labeled cabin altitude, separating the atmospheric status from any mechanical configuration warnings to prevent future operational confusion. The final minute-by-minute forensic reconstruction of dossier 24 ends here. 121 lives deleted by an invisible drop in air pressure, leaving a mountain of twisted steel as a monument to a checklist error. The trace left by Helios Airways Flight 522 is a lesson in the severe power of small details in high-consequence environments. The biological facts are immutable. A plane filled with ghosts, a lone flight attendant fighting until the final flame out, and a tiny switch that decided their fate. The ghost flight remains a cornerstone study in human factors engineering and corporate safety culture. Your mind is the final piece of this investigation. Join our community of investigators by clicking the subscribe button. Help us track the traces that the sky tries to hide in its vast silence. I am your guide through the darkness, and I will return with a new dossier very soon. Keep your mind sharp. Focus on the facts with your eyes closed. And remember, every checklist item is written in blood, and every evidence counts. This is Mind 74, and we are the keepers of the cold files. The investigation is suspended, but the file remains open. Until next time. Technical density expansion. The site of the crash in Grammatico is now marked by a permanent memorial chapel, where the biological profiles of the 121 victims are preserved. The Helios 522 file remains the definitive text in aviation psychiatry for the analysis of group hypoxic behavior and the structural limitations of solo crew intervention in pressurized aircraft emergencies.